Rimac's own Nevera electric hypercars, Bugatti Tourbillons. Rimac sells in the 911 GTS T-Hybrid. So come along on a tour with Mate, a man who, despite being boss of Rimac's.
What if the world's most extreme hypercars were never meant to be kept behind glass? The CEO behind Bugatti-Rimac takes a 310-mile highway journey in a Chiron, not a private jet. He has driven over 100,000 miles in it, while most owners barely touch theirs. From snow-covered mountain testing in a $4 million Bugatti Tourbillon to daily driving a Golf R32, nothing fits the usual hypercar rulebook. Even fuel numbers and top-speed extremes tell a story few expected. Behind the headlines, each decision challenges how hypercars are actually meant to live on the road and why preservation might not be the point at all. So, what really happened? And what does the evidence reveal? Let's explore the story. Breaking the hypercar rulebook auto show season usually means private jets, chauffeured cars, and executives arriving exactly as polished as the vehicles unveiled on stage. Mate Rimac took a different route to the Munich Auto Show entirely. Literally. Rather than flying in, the Bugatti-Rimac CEO climbed behind the wheel of his personal Bugatti Chiron and drove the 310-mile journey himself. This was not a slow, cautious crawl designed to protect a multi-million-dollar machine. Rimac's average speed across the trip landed around 64 miles per hour, a pace that included real highway driving rather than a careful procession at minimum velocity. At the same time, the journey was not a constant high-speed sprint either. By his own account, the drive included some high-speed bursts along the way, the kind of brief acceleration most owners would never risk outside a closed track. What makes this single road trip worth examining is not simply that it happened, but what it represents inside a culture built almost entirely around restraint. Hypercar ownership, for most buyers, means insurance premiums calculated around minimal mileage, climate-controlled storage, and appearances limited to car shows and...
Mate's particularly proud of one item you'll hopefully never need in your multi-million quid hypercar:
curated social media posts. Rimac's choice to drive his own Chiron through ordinary highway traffic, surrounded by commuter cars and delivery trucks, stands in direct contrast to that entire approach. Does a $4 million machine lose anything by being used exactly the way its engineers built it to be used? Rimac's actions suggest the opposite, that the real loss happens when a car built for the road never actually touches one. There is a practical dimension to this decision as well, one easy to overlook beneath the spectacle of a hypercar on public roads. A private jet for a single executive carries its own cost, scheduling complexity, and logistical overhead, especially for a journey under 350 miles, where ground transportation remains entirely feasible. Choosing to drive instead was not simply a stunt for cameras. It solved the same transportation problem private jets exist to solve. Using a vehicle Rimac already owned and had every reason to test under real conditions before its next major show appearance. That distinction between spectacle and substance matters throughout this entire story. It would be easy to frame a CEO driving his own hypercar to an auto show as pure marketing theater.
CEO of Bugatti-Rimac. Many people do not know that the world's fastest car comes from Croatia, and that the Croatian company owns Bugatti.
Engineered for headlines rather than function. But the specific numbers behind that drive, the fuel consumption, the average speed, the deliberate mix of cruising and acceleration, tell a more interesting story than theater alone could produce. Those numbers are exactly where this story turns from a clever photo opportunity into something closer to a genuine engineering statement. The reaction within the automotive community reinforced exactly that distinction. Coverage of the drive focused overwhelmingly on the specific figures involved rather than treating it as a simple novelty story, with outlets dissecting fuel economy, average speed, and tank capacity in detail, typically reserved for official manufacturer testing rather than a single executive's personal commute. That level of scrutiny is itself a signal of how unusual the underlying behavior actually was. Enthusiasts and journalists alike recognized this was not a routine occurrence, even within a culture already accustomed to seeing hypercars driven on public roads from time to time. When a hypercar meets the highway strip, away the spectacle of a Bugatti on public roads, and what remains is a set of figures that genuinely surprised much of the automotive world. Across the full 310-mile journey, Rimac's Chiron returned approximately 14.3 miles per gallon, a number that sounds modest until placed against what the same car is capable of consuming under different conditions. The contrast becomes clear once the Chiron's extremes enter the picture. The car's fuel tank holds 26.4 gallons, substantial by typical standards, but tiny relative to what the engine beneath it can consume at full throttle. At the Chiron's top speed of 261 miles per hour, that entire tank can empty in roughly 9 minutes. 9 minutes, from full to empty, sustained at a speed most public roads in the world would never legally or safely allow. Against that backdrop, 14.3 miles per gallon during real-world highway driving suddenly looks less like a disappointing number and more like remarkable restraint from a machine capable of consuming fuel at an almost absurd rate. This is the part of the story that turns a viral road trip into a legitimate engineering case study. A car engineered around extremes, blistering acceleration, a top speed few public roads can accommodate.
Rimac automobili that will see electric supercar maker raising $157 to $181 million. Its owner made Rimac
An engine drinking fuel at a rate that would empty most family sedans' tanks in a fraction of the time. Still managed reasonable, real-world efficiency the moment it was driven the way most cars are driven. Steady speeds, real traffic, a destination rather than a record attempt. Is it fair to call any hypercar efficient? Not by conventional standards, but relative to its own extremes. The Chiron's performance on that drive tells a story about engineering flexibility that a closed-track demonstration could never capture. There is also a layer of risk tolerance embedded in these numbers that deserves attention. Driving any car at highway speed for over 300 miles introduces variables no controlled test environment can replicate. Other drivers, unpredictable weather, road surface inconsistencies, mechanical wear accumulating in real time rather than under laboratory conditions. Subjecting a car worth millions of dollars to that level of unpredictable exposure is itself a statement of confidence. Confidence not just in the car's performance ceiling, but in its everyday reliability under conditions its designers never get to fully control. What these numbers ultimately prove is that the gap between a hypercar's theoretical extremes and its real-world usability is far smaller than most owners ever bother to discover. Few buyers in this category ever drive their cars far enough, or in conditions varied enough, to learn what their machines are actually capable of outside a showroom or a closed circuit. Rimac's single road trip generated more genuine usability data than most Chirons accumulate across their entire ownership history. And that single trip turns out to be only a fraction of his broader philosophy toward how these cars should be used. This kind of real-world validation carries weight that extends beyond Rimac's personal driving habits. Manufacturers across the industry rely heavily on controlled testing environments. closed circuits, climate chambers, simulated road surfaces, precisely because they allow engineers to isolate specific variables.
Bugatti's future were ongoing, and Rimac would play a role as the brands were a good technological fit. Rimac has developed an electric supercar
without the unpredictability of public roads. That controlled approach produces excellent data, but it inevitably misses the countless small variables that only emerge during genuine, unscripted driving. Variables a single 300-mile highway trip can surface in ways no laboratory ever fully replicates. There is also a psychological dimension worth considering, separate from the raw engineering value. A driver behind the wheel for over 4 hours, covering real distance through changing traffic and weather, builds an intuitive familiarity with a car that no spec sheet or dynamometer reading can replace. That kind of seat-of-the-pants understanding, how the car settles at cruising speed, how it responds to minor steering corrections, how the cabin feels after hours rather than minutes, becomes part of the institutional knowledge a CEO carries directly into future design decisions, rather than knowledge filtered second-hand through an engineering report. The anti-garage queen. The term garage queen carries a specific meaning inside car culture. A vehicle, often extraordinarily valuable, that spends nearly its entire existence parked, preserved, and almost never driven. For many collectors, this approach makes financial sense. Low mileage protects resale value, particularly for limited production icons where condition and originality command enormous premiums at auction. A pristine Chiron with fewer than 1,000 miles on the clock is not the same asset as an identical car with 6 figures behind it. Not to the auction market, and not to the insurance companies calculating exposure on a multi-million-dollar machine. Rimac has built his personal approach to ownership in direct opposition to that entire model, and he has done so with full awareness of exactly what it costs him. The numbers behind that philosophy are striking on their own. Rimac's personal Bugatti Chiron has logged approximately 109,000 miles, a mileage figure that would be considered high for an ordinary commuter sedan, let alone a hand-built hypercar produced in extremely limited numbers. His Rimac Nevera, the electric hypercar bearing his own name, has accumulated roughly 25,000 miles as well. To put that in context, the average American driver covers around 15,000 miles per year in a vehicle designed specifically for that kind of accumulation. Rimac is putting those numbers on machinery that most comparable owners treat like static sculpture. Few collectors anywhere in the world have driven cars of this caliber anywhere near that distance. Rimac has been direct about the reasoning behind this approach, stating plainly on social media that he wants his hypercars used rather than preserved. That single stated preference reframes everything else in this story. The road trip to Munich was not an isolated stunt designed for a single viral moment. It was simply one visible example of a much larger ongoing pattern of treating these machines as functional tools rather than static investments. Why would the person responsible for designing and building these cars want to see them driven into the ground rather than protected indefinitely? Because understanding a car's real limitations, its long-term reliability, and its actual behavior under accumulated stress requires putting real, sustained distance on it. Something no amount of static display or closed-track testing can substitute for. A car tested for 2,000 miles across a controlled circuit has never been asked to survive. A car with 100,000 miles on the highway has answered that question definitively. This approach does come with trade-offs that Rimac appears to have accepted without hesitation. High mileage typically reduces resale value substantially, particularly in a market where collectors specifically seek out low-mileage, pristine examples of rare vehicles. Maintenance costs and service intervals accumulate more quickly as mileage climbs, especially on a vehicle as mechanically complex as the Chiron. A car with a 16-cylinder engine producing 1,500 horsepower.
There is no turbo lag, you get the performance immediately with the roar of a V16 naturally aspirated engine.
A transmission system engineered to handle acceleration forces most drivers never experience. And hydraulic, electrical, and cooling systems all operating at tolerances that demand professional attention, at intervals no ordinary car requires. For Rimac, those costs appear to be treated as the price of genuine ownership rather than as a deterrent, a deliberate trade of long-term resale value for real-world understanding of what his own company has built. The broader collector market operates almost entirely on the opposite assumption. Auction houses routinely highlight low odometer readings as a primary selling point for limited production hypercars, sometimes commanding price premiums in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, purely on the strength of minimal use. A Bugatti Veyron with under 500 miles sells differently than one with 50,000. Not because the higher mileage car is less capable, but because the collector market values untouched potential over realized experience. Within that market logic, Rimac's approach to his own Chiron represents a direct, deliberate financial sacrifice. There is something almost contradictory, on the surface, about a man overseeing the development of the Bugatti Tourbillon, Bugatti's next-generation hypercar, still being refined and tested, while simultaneously putting six-figure mileage on its predecessor. But that contradiction dissolves once the underlying logic becomes clear. Every mile driven on the outgoing Chiron generates real data and real experience that directly informs how its successor gets engineered, tested, and ultimately built. The Garage Queen model produces beautiful, untouched machines. Rimac's model produces information, and for a man whose primary job is building the next generation of these cars, information matters more than preserved resale value ever could. The unexpected garage choice. If the road trip and the mileage numbers reveal Rimac's relationship with his hypercars, his actual daily transportation reveals something else entirely. A surprising lack of interest in driving exotic machinery for ordinary errands and commutes. Rather than arriving at his own company's headquarters in a Bugatti or a Rimac, he has repeatedly been spotted behind the wheel of a classic BMW E39 M5, a car now decades old, prized by enthusiasts for its analog feel rather than its outright performance. More recently, Rimac added an even more unexpected vehicle to his daily rotation, a Volkswagen Golf R32, a compact hot hatch producing roughly 247 horsepower.
Volkswagen Golf R32 is a product of that era, and 250 horsepower from its naturally aspirating engine.
A fraction of what either of his hypercar brands typically produces in a single vehicle. The Golf accelerates from 0 to 60 in around 6.5 seconds, respectable for its category decades ago. But a figure that looks almost quaint parked beside a car, capable of reaching that same speed in roughly 1/10 the time. This choice carries its own kind of statement, distinct from the road trip and the high-mileage philosophy already explored. Driving a hypercar long distances proves a willingness to use extreme machinery as intended. Choosing a humble hatchback for daily errands proves something closer to genuine, unpretentious car enthusiasm. An appreciation for driving itself, regardless of price tag or performance ceiling. Few executives running companies built entirely around extreme performance willingly choose a modest commuter car for their own daily transportation. when an entire fleet of far more impressive options sits available in the same garage. There is also a generational and emotional layer to this particular choice that adds further context. The Golf R32 nods toward cars Rimac drove earlier in life, long before Bugatti or Rimac Automobili existed as companies bearing his name. Choosing to revisit that earlier chapter, parked literally alongside the most advanced hypercars his career has produced, suggests a CEO who has not lost touch with where his own passion for cars actually began. That kind of continuity rarely survives this level of professional success intact, and its presence here adds genuine depth to a public image that could easily have settled for hypercars alone. For enthusiasts following Rimac's career, this particular detail tends to resonate more than any single mileage figure or road trip ever could. Plenty of executives in extreme performance industries cultivate a curated public image, built entirely around the products their companies sell, rarely revealing personal taste that diverges from that brand identity. Rimac's willingness to publicly drive, and clearly enjoy, a car costing a tiny fraction of what his own companies produce, suggests an authenticity that resonates precisely because it was never engineered to please anyone in particular. What ties this daily driver choice back to everything already covered is consistency rather than contradiction. A man who puts real mileage on his Chiron, skips private jets in favor of long highway drives, and still commutes in a decades-old BMW or a modest hatchback, is not performing different versions of the same persona for different audiences. He is applying one consistent philosophy across every vehicle he owns: that cars exist to be driven, regardless of their price tag, their performance ceiling, or how impressive they might look sitting still in a showroom. The CEO behind the wheel winter testing presents one of the clearest examples yet of this philosophy taken to its most extreme, deliberate conclusion. Faced with snow-covered mountain roads, the obvious choice for most drivers would be a vehicle built specifically for those conditions. Four-wheel drive, all-season tires, real ground clearance. Rimac had exactly that kind of vehicle available. A Jeep Wrangler parked alongside his fleet that day. He chose the Bugatti Tourbillon instead, a $4.1 million hypercar with none of the Jeep's obvious advantages for the terrain ahead.
Only 250 cars have been built. They're called the Tourbillon.
This was not an isolated, theatrical choice made purely for social media attention, though the resulting footage certainly generated plenty of it. Rimac described the moment as part of a much longer process. 5 years of development work, moving the Tourbillon from a blank sheet of paper through to genuine, real-world road testing. Closed-track testing can validate a car's performance under controlled, snow-covered mountain roads. Introduce exactly the kind of unpredictable variables: reduced traction, limited visibility, sudden changes in road surface that no track environment can fully replicate. The stakes embedded in this particular test are difficult to overstate. A car valued at over $4 million, still in active development, driven through conditions explicitly designed to challenge its limits, with genuine risk of an expensive mistake at every turn. Most manufacturers reserve this kind of extreme condition testing for disguised prototypes, driven by professional test drivers under heavily controlled circumstances, far from public view. Rimac's willingness to personally drive a recognizable, undisguised flagship hypercar through these same conditions reflects a far more hands-on approach to development than most hypercar executives ever choose to take. This stands in sharp contrast to how testing typically unfolds across the broader automotive industry. Most manufacturers separate the roles of executive and test driver entirely, relying on dedicated engineering teams to handle the most demanding evaluation work, while leadership reviews data second-hand through reports and meetings. Rimac's decision to personally sit behind the wheel during one of the more demanding tests a hypercar can face collapses that usual separation entirely, placing the company's own chief executive directly into the same risk and discomfort his engineering teams experience regularly. There is a clear through line connecting this moment back to the Munich road trip and the six-figure mileage numbers explored earlier. In every case, Rimac chooses direct, personal exposure to real-world conditions over the safer, more conventional alternative. Flying instead of driving, preserving a low-mileage collector's item instead of using it, relying on a purpose-built vehicle instead of trusting the hypercar itself. Each decision, taken individually, might look like an isolated stunt. Taken together, they form a consistent pattern from a man whose job depends on genuinely understanding what his own cars can do, not simply what they are advertised to be capable of on a spec sheet. What the snow test ultimately proves is that Rimac's entire philosophy toward hypercar ownership extends directly into how he builds the next generation of these machines. A car tested only on dry pavement and closed circuits.
We are testing the climate control in the vehicle. Of course, it's done with objective measurements in climatic chambers.
Arrives at production with real, unexamined gaps in its understanding of how it behaves under genuine adversity. By personally driving the Tourbillon through conditions explicitly designed to expose those gaps, Rimac ensures the finished product reflects lessons learned firsthand, not simply data gathered by someone else and relayed back through a report. That distinction, more than any single road trip or mileage figure, may be the clearest explanation yet for why a hypercar CEO keeps choosing the hard road over the easy one. Taken as a whole, these 5 moments: the Munich road trip, the fuel and speed figures behind it, the 6-figure mileage on cars most owners would never drive past 1,000, the modest daily commuters parked beside million-dollar machines, and a flagship hypercar tested through snow instead of a Jeep, describe something larger than a series of unrelated headlines. They describe a working philosophy, repeated consistently across every category of vehicle Rimac touches, that treats genuine use as more valuable than preserved perfection. In an industry often defined by spectacle for its own sake, that philosophy stands out precisely because it asks for nothing in return beyond a better understanding of the machines themselves. What this story ultimately reveals goes far beyond one CEO and a fleet of hypercars. It exposes a complete reversal of how these machines are usually treated. From a 310-mile Bugatti Chiron highway drive to 6-figure mileage most collectors would never risk, from a $4 million Tourbillon tested in snow to a daily routine that includes a Golf R32, every choice challenges the idea that these cars are meant to be preserved, not used. In a world obsessed with garage perfection, Rimac treats extremes as data, not decoration. And that raises one final question. When a hypercar is finally driven without limits, is that when it truly comes alive? If you enjoyed this breakdown, like, subscribe, and join the discussion below.